Okay, so tomorrow's Australia Day. And so at least we have an Australian monk giving the talk for tonight. And yes, just in case you're wondering, I was born in Perth. At least my physical birth was in Perth. My spiritual birth was in Thailand. I should, on today of all days, not fail to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Noongar people. And of course, we should never forget that the Australia Day, while for the those of like myself who descended from the invading side, is a day of celebration, but for those on the invaded side, has a slightly different connotation. Anyway, I don't want to go into the politics of it, but I think this is always important to bear in mind that these things have different connotations for different people. So I was thinking a little bit about what it meant to be an Australian and practising Buddhism, and whether there's such a thing as a particularly Australian Dhamma. Of course, Dhamma itself is universal and relates to the experience of suffering, which of course everybody has, and the origin of suffering, which we look for inside ourselves. These things are very universally human. But it's also true that in each time and place, each culture that it goes to, that Buddhism takes on something of the flavour of that culture. We can see this from the very earliest days when the Buddha himself was teaching, and of course he would use the language and the ideas and so on of the people around him. And we don't really know how that would differ if the Buddha was to be born today. How would he express himself? What kind of language would he use? What kind of ways would he use to communicate his ideas? Would he tweet, for example? Would he blog? I do not know the answer to these questions, and nor does anybody else. So Buddhism come to Australia. What are the characteristics of Australian Buddhism? Well, one of the first things that I noticed when I came back to Australia after ordaining as a monk in Thailand was the names of the monasteries and places. I don't know if you ever noticed this, but the centre that we're in now is called Dhammaloka. Yeah? Dhammaloka. Aloka meaning light. Yeah, so the light of Dhamma. And this was actually named after following another place called Buddhaloka, the light of the Buddha, and there was another one called Sanghaloka, the light of the Sangha. I think we're beginning to see a theme emerging here. And then there's a monastery in near Sydney called Aloka, which just means light, and another one called Buddha Rangsi, yeah, the radiance of the Buddha. Yeah. And quite a few others of a similar sort. So that's a theme, isn't it? The theme of light. And it is one of the most noticeable things. Certainly when I first travelled to Asia, and I remember when I arrived in Bangkok for the first time, and you're sort of walking around Bangkok at night time, and you've got this kind of murky yellow sky thing in there. You can't see any stars or anything like that. And the quality of the light is very different. So there's something very vibrant. You notice that a lot in Perth, of course. Very kind of brilliant, very vital about the quality of the light in Australia. So this is, I think, one one characteristic or one of the features of the land which has a resonance in some way with our Buddhist ideas. When I was studying the Dhamma, one of the things that I noticed as I sort of went further and further into studying the Dhamma was how many of the things which I found there were things that I could really connect with, and things which in many ways I felt were more relevant, or I could see more in Australian culture than I could even in some of the aspects of traditional Buddhist cultures. So, for example, one of the features of Australian culture, which I think Australians are usually very proud of, is that we're very... we don't like to be bossed around too much. We're a bit kind of stubborn and opinionated, and we don't like sort of some toff above us telling us what to do. And we have this kind of Ned Kelly, Eureka Stockade kind of heritage. So there's a bit kind of anti-hierarchical attitude in Australian culture. And so I found it was quite interesting when I was looking at the way that Buddhism was practiced, and you see the way that Buddhism is practiced very often is extremely hierarchical. It's very, very much a kind of top-down system. But the way that the Buddha himself taught was not like that at all. And the Buddha actually is the only spiritual teacher that I know of that's given whole, quite lengthy discourses explaining how to question him, how to not take everything that he said for granted, how to test all of the statements that he makes. In modern Buddhist culture, we're very familiar with the Kalama Sutta. So most of you have probably heard or seen that quoted or referred to in some way. In the Kalama Sutta, the Buddha says that we shouldn't just believe anything based on faith and so on. Actually, there's many, many suttas other than the Kalama Sutta where the Buddha talks about this kind of thing. And he actually gives like this kind of list of questions. This is how you should test me. Do I practice the things that I teach about? Do I tell people, let go of greed, hatred and delusion, but then do I nourish those things within myself? And so he gives this very kind of detailed program. And the way that the Buddha set up his community, and he taught his community of, mainly the community of monks and nuns, was very much along these lines. So there wasn't that sense of top-down ordering and hierarchy, but very much a sense of shared brotherhood or sisterhood among the Sangha. All decisions have to be made in common, that there's no sense of that there's one person who has power to give the orders over another, and these kinds of things. So I found these ideas very much resonated with my upbringing from Australia, and it's something that I've tried to bring into Australian culture, into Australian Buddhism to some degree. And a first example of it was through Ajahn Brahm, who already had introduced many of these kinds of ideas. And I think this is something that's really important to bear in mind from a Buddhist point of view. Actually, the truth is the truth. The Dhamma is the Dhamma. Just because somebody's been in robes, or somebody's a senior Ajahn, or somebody's been around longer than you, or something like that, doesn't make them better than you, doesn't make them somehow superior or have power over anybody. So we're not governed by an individual who has that sense of personal charisma or power. We're governed by the Dhamma. After the Buddha passed away, they asked Venerable Ananda, who is it that's going to run the community now? Who's going to be in charge of Buddhism now that the Buddha's gone? And Ananda said, there's nobody. And they said, well, isn't that chaos? What's going to happen? And he said, well, the Dhamma is in charge. It's not me. It's not one other person who's in charge. It's the Dhamma who's in charge. And so it's honouring and revering the Dhamma. So I think this is a very important quality that we can bring to Buddhism. We've already seen many results in that. For example, an obvious example being the bhikkhuni ordination, which we performed a few years ago now. And with the bhikkhuni ordination, that needed a kind of a strength to be able to say, well, what's right and what's wrong, to be able to stick to doing what's right and what's wrong, rather than just doing what you're told. And if we had just been content to do what we were told, then we would never have done the bhikkhuni ordination. But we stuck to what our sense of what's right and what's wrong, what's fair. And so I don't think it's a a coincidence that was done here in Australia. Another aspect of Australian Buddhism, I think, which is quite important, is this idea, the fact that we're a very multicultural community. And I think this is so obvious it hardly needs pointing out. We look around the room here, and you see people from all different backgrounds. Yeah, and most of us don't really know what our backgrounds are. I don't know what my background is. I know I've got some ancestors from England, and probably some from other places in Europe and so on, but I don't really know. And even though when people come here, maybe it matters for a while where you come from. But after a generation or two, it doesn't matter anymore. And there's something a bit sad to that in a way. There's certainly like a loss of culture. And I think that's something that our Buddhist communities, our traditional Buddhist communities are dealing with. I find that a lot. I teach a lot in Sydney, and I find that a lot with the traditional Buddhist communities, at the Sri Lankan community and the Vietnamese community and the Thai community and so on, want to convey their culture, their language, their stories, their ideas to their children, but the children are not all that interested. So it's always, it's not that they're completely disinterested, they don't mind, but it's a struggle, yeah? And that will last maybe a generation or two, yeah? But then it'll go away, yeah? For better or for worse. I'm not saying that's a good thing, it's just how it is. But the one of the advantages of that, I think, is that in terms of Buddhist practice, is that we do have a great melding of different forms of Buddhism. We can encounter Buddhists from the Zen tradition. We have here multicultural Buddhism on display here. We have a monk from Korea whose traditional background in Korea would be practicing Zen Buddhism, but he's come here to practice with Ajahn Brahm. Another monk here from Bangladesh, and in Bangladesh, of course, they have the traditional Theravadan practice, one of the oldest Buddhist cultures in the world. And in the audience are many people from different backgrounds. And I find this is a very, very powerful and very strong thing. And it's not just encountering Buddhism, but encountering people from many different faiths and lack of faith. I think it's really, really important that we, as people who are following a particular spiritual path, that we encounter, talk with, discuss with, and try to learn from and share with people who have different backgrounds and different faiths. Again, it's something I do quite a lot of in different interfaith forums and so on. We have that great opportunity. If we don't do that, we become very complacent. We become too inward-looking. We become too dismissive of other ways and so convinced of the rightness of our own way. And that road leads to fundamentalism. It doesn't lead to anywhere good. And yes, you can have Buddhist fundamentalism. It's like you can have any other kind of fundamentalism. So I think we have a very good opportunity to learn from people from other faiths and to rejoice in that fact. Most of the time in Buddhism we do that very well, sometimes not so well. I've had discussions with, for example, a child from a Buddhist family who, even though she was brought up in a Buddhist family, she decided to become a Christian. Right? What would you do? Your daughter comes home one day and says, "No, I want to become a Christian." You're like, "What? Why?" You can't understand it. Well, she obviously has their reasons. Yeah? And in that case, the family didn't handle it very well, and did things like taking the Bible and throwing it out and these kinds of things. Yeah, it's not very respectful, is it? It's not very Buddhist. The Buddha never said that everyone had to become a Buddhist. That's completely against the Dhamma. Actually, what the Buddha said about that was when he talked to people from other faiths, and this is in the Digha Nikaya, the Udumbarika Sihanada Sutta, the Buddha said, "You may think that I teach you to convert you, but do not think so. Let your teacher remain your teacher. Let your practices remain your practices. I'm not teaching to convert anybody. I'm only teaching to help you to overcome suffering." Yeah, that's all. So the Buddha is not concerned to convert anybody or persuade anybody to become a Buddhist. So now in Australia, we always like to say, Buddhism's the fastest growing religion in Australia, and we're very, we're very proud of ourselves. But that's not a very Buddhist way to think about it, really. We should actually be rejoicing if other numbers of other religions are growing. We should be rejoicing, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. If people are happy to become Christians, then we should be sadhu, sadhu. That's so wonderful. If people are happy to become a Muslim, then sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. That's so wonderful that they found a path in life and found something that's given them meaning. Even if it's not the same path that we might choose, but it's a path that's given them meaning. So I think Australia on the whole has been a very successful multicultural country. I think obviously that's not always the case, and there obviously are problems. And in the past, Australia has been a very racist country, and I think that there are still remnants of that, especially in the treatment of the Aboriginal community, and also in Australia's immigration policy. And personally, I find Australia's immigration policy with the refugees and so on to be a great embarrassment. And I think is the last vestige, really, of the White Australia policy. Hopefully is something that we can overcome in the next generation. But with these caveats and reminders that we are flawed and imperfect like anybody else, I think that there is something that's been very successful and very promising about Australian multiculturalism and about the way that we've learnt and assimilated people from different backgrounds and so on. And I think that has certainly influenced myself, my own Buddhist practice, and I think has influenced Buddhism more generally in Australia. So I think this is one of the other characteristics of Buddhism in Australia, is it has a strong interfaith presence. Another aspect of Buddhism in Australia, which I think is a bit more subtle maybe, is something to do with the landscape. And Australians love the bush. I mean, we have a very kind of positive relationship to nature, even though the nature is quite harsh. So there's like a respect for it. We respect the desert and the bushfires and the rips in the ocean and the crocodiles and all those other things, and the snakes. So we have like a respect for it. It can be dangerous, and it's powerful, and it's untamed. But we also love it, and we appreciate it. And this is something which is not necessarily shared everywhere in the world. And I've been quite surprised staying in many cities in Malaysia and other places where, people really didn't have any connection with the bush, with the forest. I remember once when I was staying at the monastery. I was recently at Sati Monastery near Sydney, and some visitors from Indonesia came. And we were walking through the path through the forest and so on, and I said, how does this compare with the jungles or the forests in Indonesia? And they said, we've never been to the forest in Indonesia. So I think even though Australia is a very urbanised country, I think we do have this love of nature, and partly, of course, to do with the fact that there's a lot of it, right? There's a lot of space. in Australia. Yeah? Compared to most places in the world, we're extremely lucky to have a lot of space and a lot of peace and quiet. So it's probably about the best place in the world to make forest monasteries and meditation centres, right? Lots of land, it's not too expensive, and lots of peace and quiet, and very fresh air, and not too many mosquitoes. So it's interesting that the most vibrant and strongest centres of Buddhism we see in Australia, everywhere, in every city in Australia, is in the forest monasteries. And again, this contrasts quite strongly with traditional Buddhism, where you have most traditional Buddhist countries. You have both monasteries in the city and in the forest, but usually the monasteries in the forest, there's much less of them. Proportionally, there's only a few, relatively. And most of the emphasis is on the city monasteries and the town monasteries and the village monasteries. Whereas in Australia it's the other way around. The main monastic centres are in the forest and only smaller ones in the cities. And I think there's something also quite meaningful about that, and there's something that speaks to an Australian character. So these are just a few characteristics or a few qualities that I think Australian Buddhism has or has had, that in some way are influenced by our culture, by our geography, by our history. But one thing which I think we need to be careful of, and I think which is something which we can be prone to do in Australia, is to be too dismissive. And I think that we can be quite, and I've seen this a lot with especially young Australian people who are practising Dhamma, is they can be very dismissive of traditional Buddhism and traditional Buddhist cultures and so on. And I think this is a shame, because we've obviously got a lot to learn from those. And somehow we feel that we want to get a kind of Dhamma, a kind of Buddhist practice that's going to get rid of all the accretions and accumulations, and is going to just be like a pure Dhamma practice. And I think there's something important about that. I think there's some a positive side to that aspiration. I don't think it's wrong. But it's important to understand that however we relate to the Dhamma, wherever we are, it doesn't matter where we are in the world or what time we are, we relate as a human being first and foremost. So yes, there might be a few little bits and pieces where we're influenced by the fact of our background, we're Australian or Thai or Finnish or whatever. But the core of the thing, the heart of the matter, it doesn't really matter where you're from. Even aliens is okay, right? I don't mean aliens in the sense of like foreigners. I mean aliens in the sense of like outer space. Because of course from Buddhist point of view, there's many, many different worlds, right, throughout the galaxy, and many, many different inhabited worlds, right, with sentient beings on them, and they all suffer. They all know what it's like to feel sad or angry, or whatever the alien equivalent of sad and angry is. So all the externals, male and female, black and white, and so on, these things are not very important. When we come to practice, we turn our mind inwards and we look with our mind's eye at what's actually happening in our heart, in the present. And that is not Australian, it's not Asian, it's not old, it's not young. It just is. So that the externals of things, the signs saying Happy Australia Day and the balloons and all of these kinds of things, these can be useful to help to kind of support our practice, but we shouldn't take them too seriously. Otherwise we can get caught up, we can identify with those externals, and then there'll be a lot of suffering. Like tomorrow, isn't there a cricket match tomorrow? Yeah? Is that happening tomorrow? Sri Lanka versus Australia? So that could be a lot of suffering, isn't it? Australia got trounced last time, so... I don't know what happens. What happens in the Sri Lankan families? Is it like the parents go for Australia and the kids go for Sri Lanka and the kids go for Australia? Is it something like that? Probably depends where you are. So it's like playing around, and that kind of attitude that you bring towards a game, like cricket or something, you play around with it. And then it can be useful, it can be fun. But you don't take it too seriously, yeah? Unless you're playing England, of course, that's different. But don't take, if it's Ashes, then that's serious. But don't take it too seriously. And so this is the thing. And I think that's kind of a quality of Australian culture, that we're not so hung up on our Australianness. We're not so sort of jingoistic, and it's a very kind of light-hearted way of holding our nationality. I always remember when I tried to define what Australianness is, when I caught a plane back to Australia one time, and like when you step onto Qantas flight, it's like stepping back into Australia, and we're flying back in, and somebody said to the steward in the airplane, he said, "Excuse me, sir," and he turned around and said, "Sorry, did you just call me sir?" And the person said, yes. He said, "Oh, could you do that again, please?" So to me, that's a good kind of example of the Australian attitude to things. So when we look in our heart, do you see a light there? That's really Australian Buddhism. Yeah? Is that light just an external light? Is that just the light of the sun? Is that light just the harsh light of the sun reflecting off the sand on the Perth's shiny beaches? It's just so bright you have to cover your eyes. Is that the only light we know of? So from a Buddhist point of view, that external light is not the light that really matters. When I think about that, I'm always reminded of this conversation or this dialogue. It's in one of the ancient Indian scriptures. It's actually a pre-Buddhist scripture, one of the Upanishads. And it's a dialogue between one of the great sages of that time, Yajnavalkya, and a king, Janaka. And at that time, Yajnavalkya, or the king approached Yajnavalkya to ask him a question. And Yajnavalkya just wanted to meditate. He didn't want to talk to the king. So he was going to keep quiet. But he'd previously made a promise to the king that he would always answer any question that he asked. So the king asked him, "What is a person's light?" And Yajnavalkya didn't really want to answer, so he just sort of gave the simplest answer he could. He said, "A person's light is the sun, because it's by the light of the sun that you can walk around, find your way home." And the king said to him, "Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. That's wonderful, Yajnavalkya. That's such a profound answer. But what happens when the sun goes down? What then is a person's light?" And Yajnavalkya said, "Well, that time, great king, a person's light is the moon. Because by the light of the moon, even though it's night time, you can still find your way around." And the king said, "Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. That's wonderful, Yajnavalkya. Your discernment is amazing and your answers are perfect." He said, "But what happens when the sun's gone down and there's no moon? What then is a person's light?" And Yajnavalkya says, "Well, great king, when the sun has gone down and there's no moon, at that time a person's light is the stars. Because by the light of the stars, you can still make your way around, even though it's quite dark." And the king said, "Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu, Yajnavalkya, that's a wonderful answer. Your profundity is amazing. But What happens if it's a cloudy night and there's no sun and there's no moon and there's no stars? What then is a person's light? And Yajnavalkya said, well, great king, when there's no sun and no moon and no stars, at that time you get an LED torch and that's your light. Well, he didn't say LED, I made that bit up. He said you light a lamp, and you use the lamp and you can find your way around even when it's completely dark. And the king said, sadhu, sadhu. This is characteristic of this dialogues between the king, this particular king, and Yajnavalkya. Yajnavalkya, this particular sage, he'd never liked to divulge the truth. He always had to be kind of pushed and pushed and pushed. Anyway, so the king said, what happens when the sun has gone down and there is no moon and the sky is covered with thick black clouds and there's no stars and then you don't have a lamp? What then is a person's light? And Yajnavalkya said, well then, great king, is the light in the heart. So this is the light, I think, which is what the Buddha talked about very often. He used these words like the radiant mind. And when people hear these ideas like the radiant mind, there's always this kind of tendency to theorize about it and try to turn this idea into some kind of self or soul or something like that. But when the Buddha talked about the radiant mind, what did he really mean? And just like if you walk outside, you can see, if it's daytime and that bright Perth midday sun, and it's so bright you can see everything. All of the colours are incredibly vibrant. All the shadows are well defined. You can see so clearly in that air. That's what the Buddha meant when he talked about the radiant mind. He's talking about an experience. He's not talking about something which we should try to get attached to. He's saying, when you meditate properly, the darkness which you have in your heart will fall away. The clouds which cover that light will pass. The dirt which stops you from knowing and stops you from seeing, that will be polished away until the mind is gleaming and bright, like a shining mirror, or like a bright lamp, or even like the light of the sun. Again, this is not just an idea, this is an experience, and you can experience this. It's not something the Buddha taught just as a nice-sounding philosophy. He said, this is what we should be experiencing. This is what everybody's mind has the potential to experience this, to experience what it means for the mind to be radiant, to experience what it means for the mind to be full of light. If your mind is everything that you know, and so if your mind is full of light, then everything that you know is full of light. That light is something that you can experience a little bit if you meditate, and you just find a greater sense of clarity. Even if you find just excuse my voice, even if you find just a bit of clarity, a bit more steadiness, and a bit more, a kind of more vivid awareness, That's the beginnings of this sense of the light that you have inside you. And it's funny, isn't it, how we have this almost innate or natural response to this idea. When we have this idea that, your mind can be full of light, it's like we want that. We're interested in it. It's like we prick up our ears. We're like, what is that? Our minds want to know. And I think this is one of the basic insights that we have to make in our spiritual practice. It's the nature of our minds to know. And we want to know more. We want to know better. But we get confused and we lose our way and we don't understand cause and effect. And because we don't understand cause and effect, we want to know better and clearer, but we constantly do things that make our consciousness shrink and darken and become more fragmented. We drink alcohol or take drugs, or we bombard our senses with all kinds of fragmenting and dispersing things. We send our mind out into 1,000,001 different avenues. And then when we come to meditate, we're surprised at the fact that his mind isn't peaceful. You know, there was a saying that was made by a German scholar, Max Müller, who said that it was not possible for people in these days with our rapid communications and transport for people to realize that same states of peace of mind that the ancient sages of India realized. And I think we can all agree that that's very true, or at least there's some truth to that. He said that in the 1880s. In the 1880s, the pace of life was so fast, you could send a letter and it would arrive before the end of the week. There's so much distraction and so much stress that it was difficult to meditate and find that peace of mind. So we send our mind out in all of these things. And then we wonder when we come to meditate, why isn't our mind peaceful? Meditation's so hard, we say. We go to the meditation teacher and we say, give us the trick. What's going to make my mind peaceful? Well, there's no trick. There's no special method. The mind's conditioned. If you condition the mind towards darkness, the mind will become dark. Simple as that. If you condition the mind towards light, it will become light. But that's the good news, is because it's the nature of the mind to want to know, that if we let the mind incline towards that stillness and that peace and that joy, then that light will come to it naturally. It's not so hard. We just have to let it become still. And if we let it become still, then those glimmers and gleams that we might first discern when we begin to meditate, we begin to see something more. It turns into, gradually we're watching our breath, and then one day when you're watching the breath you can realize, it's actually like a gentle light, maybe like a mist, or like a candle flame or something like that, like a soft moonlight. And you can actually see this glow emerging in the breath as you're meditating. You can see this light coming into your mind, and it really feels like a light. And very commonly people will literally open their eyes and they'll think, somebody's turned the light on in the room. Yeah, and you're sitting there and you're really tempted to say, does this mean the sun's come out or something? Or is this just going on in my mind? And you're tempted to open your eyes. And you have a quick peek. Oh, no, it really is in my mind. And then you close your eyes and go, oh, it's gone now. Oh. But that's just the nature of your mind. It's nothing special. It's very, very ordinary. It's just like it's the nature of the sky. You go out today and a beautiful Perth summer's day and you see the incredibly vivid blue sky. That's just how the sky is. When there's no clouds in it and there's no pollution and there's no dust and all of those other things, it's the nature of the sky to be blue and clear. It's the nature of your mind to be clear and radiant when it doesn't have all of these things clogging it up. So you let your mind become more and more and more peaceful. You don't make it become peaceful. You don't do anything. You just don't get in the way. And so many times I've found this kind of surreal experience when I've been teaching meditation and I teach and I say, don't force your mind, don't control it, don't make it do anything. And then at the end of it somebody will ask and say, my understanding of meditation is that you have to make your mind still and peaceful and you have to contain it and you have to stop the thoughts from coming in. And I'm saying, no. That's exactly what I said not to do for the last hour. Your mind wants to be peaceful. You don't have to force it to be peaceful. You go down to the beach after this talk tonight. You sit on the beach and watch the waves coming in and out. And just feel how peaceful that is. And then ask yourself, do I have to make myself watch these waves? Do I have to force myself to look at the ocean and the currents of the ocean? It's natural that you do that. It's natural that you be peaceful. If you're in that right context. And so we develop that that perception, that way of seeing in your meditation. So it's just natural that you see, okay, it's just how the breath goes. You just naturally watch it and you just be peaceful. The breath is everywhere in your body. You feel the breath wherever you are, whatever you're doing. Just bring attention to that and let it soothe you. So it's not like it's something that you have to sort of focus on and make yourself pay attention to. It's something which is there already. The hard work is ripping yourself away from that and forcing your mind into other places. That's hard work. So think of the present as being something that's very kind of easeful and very comfortable. Somebody reminded me earlier that sometimes previously I gave the difference about the present and the present moment. And so even though in Buddhism we talk a lot about the present moment, I don't really like talking about the present moment because the moment bit is too tight. Actually, the Buddha never used the phrase the present moment. So the word in Pali is Paccuppannakkana, and that's only found in the later Buddhism. And the Buddha would only talk about the present. And so sometimes I use the simile that the present moment is like walking on a tightrope, whereas the present is like riding on a camel. Right? It's nice and broad and kind of wobbles a bit. Yeah. It's a friendly camel. Right? Yeah, so that kind of present has got this kind of breadth to it. And the present also is a present, right? That's what present means. It's something that somebody gives to you. That's when it's the present. You watch the present. You don't say, how am I going to make myself pay attention to that present that somebody gives you, right? When somebody gives you a present, you're like, oh, you're so happy. Yeah, oh, what's in there? You want to see what the present is, yeah? You naturally become happy. But that really is what present is. It's not just a language game. That's really what present is. The present is a gift. As we're sitting here right now, we are awake. Well, most of us anyway, I think with me. we're alive, and we have so many blessings in our lives. Living here in Australia is a very blessed nation. We call ourselves a lucky country. Yeah? We've got good air, we've got good water, got good beer, so many things. We used to have a good cricket match before they were demolished by the Sri Lankans last week. Good cricket team. Anyway, so many good things. Good monasteries. And so we have so many blessings that we take for granted here in Australia. And that's one of the perhaps the less admirable qualities of Australian culture, is that we can be very cynical. Kind of the tall poppy syndrome, where we like to sort of cut people down to size. But we always should remember that all these things that we have, they are a gift. And so we shouldn't squander that, just like if somebody gives you a present, you don't just say, oh yeah, whatever, and then throw it out. Okay, at least you wait till the person goes before you throw it out. But no, you treat it as something that's very valuable. It has a meaning for you. Yeah? And so this present has a meaning. All our life takes place only in the present. Right? Life doesn't take place anywhere else. Life is the present. If you're not present for the present, you've lost it. Right? You spend your whole life not alive, really. So there's something to this idea of this kind of this freshness of things, this newness of things. Again, speaking about Australia Day, I should use a surfing analogy. It's like you're surfing, and it's down the front of the wave. Yeah, so you're always cutting down the front of that wave. It's like living life in the present. Yeah. Also, I think is something which is very lucky for us in Australia and Australian culture, is that we get to experience that flowering and that blossoming of Buddhism and of Dhamma. We don't have the same depth of Buddhist traditions and legends and monuments and all of those things, which of course are all very beautiful. I mean, I'm apart from other things, I love Buddhist history, and I study Buddhist history a lot. But there's something beautiful to not having that, because that's all in the past. What's actually in the present is what we're creating now. So Buddhism in traditional countries is always looking back to its past, whereas Buddhism in Australia is very much on the present and very much on the future. We're creating it right now. We're creating the traditions and the legends and the stories and so on. In the future, people will tell legends about Eddie Koo and his Australia Days decorations. So when we come to our mind in meditation, it's that same thing, is that we shouldn't be caught up on what was in the past, what was in our last meditation, what's the right way of doing it, what's the wrong way of doing it. But we should be experiencing and valuing it and cherishing the present as it is gifted to us. One of the best lessons on meditation I always remember was from one of the teachings that Ajahn Mahabua gave. I can't remember where it was, but it was one of the Thai forest ajahns, and he said that when he was practising, he reached a certain point in his practice where he had some kind of obstacle. I can't remember what the obstacle was, but anyway, he had some kind of obstacle. And then he investigated and inquired, and he found a way of overcoming that obstacle. So he's like, okay, now I know how to overcome that obstacle. And he kept on practising. Later on, that same obstacle came back to him. And he thought, I know this one. I know how to overcome this. So he did the same thing that he did before to overcome it. And it didn't work. Yeah? And that is Dhamma. Yeah? We're always looking for something which is the right method, the perfect answer, the way of overcoming things, the way of doing things. But we find that out in the present. What do we do now that's going to do that? Because every situation is different. And just like in Australian culture and Australian history, we don't have this sense of ourselves as being an ancient or a timeless culture. We're a very young culture, and we changed dramatically in a very short time. So each situation, each occasion is new. We don't have a wealth of precedent, which is weighing us down. So in our meditation, just like with everything else, so with our meditation, as we go deeper and deeper into it, and we experience that light and that radiance that comes from purifying the mind, the real wisdom in meditation comes from seeing and knowing that clarity of mind. It doesn't come from our ideas about it, it comes from that experience. Okay, so that's my talk for this evening on Australia Day, and I offer that for your reflection and hopefully amusement. And if there's anyone has any comments or questions or some good jokes for us, that would be most appreciated.
Can I say something?
Can I stop you, Eddie?
On Australian Buddhism. Okay. Yeah. You see, Ajahn Sujato, I see Australian Buddhism, okay, as, how do I say, Theravada Buddhism, the Buddha's teaching, okay, minus all these rites and rituals, okay, and attended by people from, like, we are a good example here now, from various ethnic backgrounds, and from various ethnic as well as religious backgrounds too. You see what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah. Like looking back in history, okay, when Buddhism went to the different countries, okay, it mingled with the local mores, folkways, it formed a Buddhism of itself. They even have the local gods, incorporated in Buddhism. Yeah. Look here now, we have people from, especially Western people, they come from Christian backgrounds. You understand? So it's a form of Buddhism. It's a Theravada Buddhism minus the rites and rituals. You understand? Yeah. And attended by people from various ethnic backgrounds. That's our composition, isn't it? That's Australia. You could call it multicultural or whatever.
So Australian Buddhism is not Mahayana Buddhism?
Mahayana, sorry, I mean, to no offense, it's more towards like a, how do I say, cultural, It's like a, you go to a Chinese one, they tok. So it wouldn't appeal to a lot of Western people. You see what I mean? It's going to be something, it's more towards the Buddha's teaching, as I see it. So look, I might be wrong. That's my thinking. What do you think?
Well, this is a kind of a complex question. Yeah, there's some truth to that idea that we're, certainly Australians are not so into the whole rites and rituals thing. But also, these things are always much more complex than we imagine. I always thought that this tradition was fairly kind of light on the rituals and so on, but I didn't realise until I went to Townsville several years ago. There was a Thai monk staying there, and he had like a meditation group, and I thought, oh well, because it's Thai people, they like doing lots of chanting and so on and so forth, it would be like that. But no, it was much more stripped back than anything I've seen that we do here. There was like no bowing, no nothing like that. The whole thing consisted of, and I'm not kidding you, the whole thing consisted of start walk meditation. This is what he said. This was the instructions. Start walk meditation. Stop walking meditation. Start sit meditation. Stop sit meditation. That's it. Right? There was no bowing, no chanting, no talk, no nothing, right? So I really don't think you could get much more stripped back as a Buddhist tradition than that, right? So So it's, you can't really generalize about these things. That was a Thai monk. He just come out from Thailand, and that was how he wanted to teach. And it worked really well, actually. People came along and they really enjoyed it. So I do think that there's something to that idea that we'll want to strip things back. But I think it's also important to acknowledge the fact that we'll also want to bring things into Buddhism. Right? It's not just we want to take things away, we also want to make our own contributions. And so we have to work out what are the useful and the good things from Australian culture that can be used to help us to practice the Dhamma more effectively today.
No, sorry. What I mean is Australian Buddhism, something more simple, whereby it could be appeal to the different, ethnic people from ethnic backgrounds,
Mm-hmm.
That's why I see. Sorry, I might be wrong.
So you think we should have a new form of Buddhism?
Well, if it's going to be Australian, it's going to be some things in it,
Not necessarily.
Sorry, anyway, it's just Buddhism in Australia is still very new. It takes time, to evolve.
Yeah, well, I think whatever happens, Buddhism in Australia will be diverse. I don't think there'll be any one thing that will be Australian Buddhism. Australians come in all shapes and sizes. Okay, another question. Well, that's another quality of Australians, is we like asking questions, don't we?
Not so much a question, but a comment. Bit of comment just earlier. You were speaking about interacting with people from different faiths and how we might kind of honour their different belief systems and that. And just during the week, I saw a Life of Pi, and the main character in that, he goes about when he's younger, just interacting completely in different faiths. Like he actually becomes a Christian, becomes like a Muslim.
Okay.
And interacts in these different things. And I just thought that was a really interesting reflection for people, if you haven't seen it, to kind of see the film. And
So that was what? Sorry, I missed it.
It was a film, Life of Pi, that's come out.
Life of Pi, okay, yeah.
But I thought it was a cool reflection on how we can kind of integrate different things, and how we saw, even though the practices were different, as the essence of all of those things is the same.
Right. Yeah.
Which is something that obviously you very much condone in Ajahn Brahmanas as well.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that's very important, and I mean the I think Australian culture has really changed drastically. I mean, when I grew up, I went to a Catholic school, and so unsurprisingly, it was mostly Catholics there, and so we didn't learn anything about other religions and so on. But Australia actually, I think, I mean, we didn't even learn anything about Christianity. When I went to a Catholic school, we had like Christian brothers teaching us and stuff like that, but they never actually taught us anything about it. The religion class was just a goof-off class. You never really learnt anything. And so, yeah, the whole religion thing was very kind of low-key, certainly when I was growing up. These days, I think it's probably become a bit more to the fore. Yeah. So very quiet tonight. Okay, that's good. Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, we might wrap up. Before we finish, if I'd just like to say a few words. Linda mentioned earlier about the early Buddhism course, and if I might just say a few words about it. I have a couple of copies of the course manual if anybody wants them. The details will be up on the BSWA website shortly. The idea is that this is something that I discussed with mainly with Ajahn Brahmali, and we wanted to present a way of this idea of what early Buddhism is. So by early Buddhism, we basically mean the Buddhism that the Buddha taught, and to try to approach this in a historical manner, to look at the context, the time, and the place, to sort of ask questions like, how do we know what it is that the Buddha taught and what he didn't teach? What are the methods that we use for discerning and differentiating between earlier and later forms of Buddhism, and so on? One of the great benefits and purposes of doing this is that if you have a good knowledge, good understanding of what it is that the Buddha really taught, then you can always see all of the later developments of Buddhism in that light. You can see how different traditions will draw off different aspects of what the Buddha taught and emphasize maybe one aspect or the other aspect. And so what appear to be often very different practices and ways of teaching and so on, when you can trace them back to their origin, then you can see where they come together, what they have in common. And you can see why the differences have arisen in different places, different times, different contexts, different cultures, and so on. So this, I think, is very useful for us to help to understand that. I mean, as I mentioned, one of the characteristics of Buddhism in Australia is it's very diverse. We do have so many different teachers and backgrounds, and you can get books on any kind of Buddhism and so on and so forth. So that can be good. It can give you a lot of wisdom, but it can also be confusing, and we don't know how things all fit together. So I've always found that the best way of knowing how things fit together is to understand them in their history, in their time, in their place, and then you can make sense of a lot of things. So the idea of the course is that we do a one-day workshop. That one-day workshop will consist of teachings, meditations, and discussions. We're not going to do too much kind of long teaching spells, but usually about 20 minutes of teaching and maybe 10 minutes of meditation as a break. And we'll sort of alternate that, and then have small group discussions and so on. So there'll be a one-day workshop on a Sunday once per month for 6 months. So in other words, there's 6 workshops once a month. And one of the crucial features of the course is that there's reading for each workshop. So if you want to register for the course, we do ask that people register. You can't just show up. And when you register, we're going to put a little thing saying, when I'm registering, I understand that I will do all the reading before the classes. Okay? So in other words, if you tick it and you don't intend to do the reading, then you're breaking your precepts. All right? So we're trying to do that to give you some motivation, to actually read, and it'll be mostly Buddhist suttas, discourses of the Buddha, as well as a smaller amount of secondary literature. And we're trying to calculate it so that it's about an hour or two of reading per week. Okay, so if you do an hour or two of reading per week, then that should be enough. And when I was talking about this with Ajahn Brahmali, he said, don't be ridiculous. Everybody's got to wait till the day before and do the reading. Okay, fair enough, that might happen. But anyway, we can try. So if you do, I think an hour or two of reading per week is not too much to ask. And that means by when we come to the class, we'll share that in common, and then we can hopefully use the class time for the workshop time for really digesting and understanding the material, so that by the end of it, we'll have a really good understanding of what early Buddhism was, what the Buddha taught, why he taught it, what was the context, and as well as learning about those things, even more importantly, is to learn the method and the means, so that when we have questions about those things, we can find the answers for ourselves. So this is the course. As I said, I have a few copies of this. There's a few more copies on the registration desk, on the front desk inside there. And the registration and details will be up on the BSWA website within a few days. Okay. So let's finish by paying respects to the Triple Gem.